everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the Client Experience webinar program. We're delighted to have everybody together again for this session on how to drive efficiency internally and externally. And we're going to efficiently use our time today by cracking on straight away with a poll that we'd love you to start voting on now. Of the two options below, which one would you go for? Where would you most like to improve efficiency right now? Is it internally with your team, or is it externally in terms of the provision of advice by third parties or the way that they are managed? Please get voting now. Vote away. Okay. Right, 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's end the poll and share the results. Okay, so we can see that there's a clear message again for today's audience. Joanne, I'll pass the baton, if you like, over to you to introduce the panelists and the topic today.
Thank you so much, Judith. Welcome, everyone. So good to see some familiar faces again and some names. Thank you so much for joining us. I love the results of the survey. 82% focused on internal efficiencies. We did a session earlier today and had the similar sort of weighting. So good to see, and we're going to definitely address some of your questions today. But the reality is, and you know it obviously better than anybody, there's this pressure on law departments to operate in this dynamic that we've often heard expressed as more for less. And there's this burning desire to uncover operational efficiencies. We know that your workloads are increasing. At the same time, perhaps your budgets may be shrinking. And so it feels like maybe there's just like you're in a pressure cooker, or there's just no more stretch in that band to give, as it were. But at the same time, of course, there's no margin for error and little to no margin on quality or service back to the business. Delighted to be part of today's discussion as we highlight some ways in which you and your teams can uncover efficiencies, both in the way that you operate internally, which is clearly a priority, but also, as Judith mentioned, with your external providers. My name is Joanne Wakeford. I'm Chief Client Officer with In-House Solutions, and we work with our clients all around the world to help them become more efficient and effective in the way in which they operate. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Scott Singer and Ash Reese, who are focused on really alleviating the stress of delivering that more for less through our next generation legal service offering at Dentons Helix. They bring really the best of private practice and a managed legal service model together to manage a portfolio of work for you on a fixed fee basis, while of course leveraging great things like data and tech. So they will no doubt have some terrific insights to share. With that, I think I'll pass it over to Ash, please, Judith. Once I cover the agenda, apologies, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. All right, well, this is exciting because we are going to look at both internal and external efficiencies. And I think what's exciting, and Ash is going to take us and Scott through what inefficient looks like. It's easier sometimes to understand what efficient looks like. And then from there, we're going to give some real solid tips and suggestions in terms of where can you take your team and where can you take your external advisors. We're going to be really focused on providing some of those actionable items that you can think about today or tomorrow to really truly leverage. And of course, I welcome you. Please do jump into the chat with questions. We hope to answer them throughout the program. If not, we'll save some time at the end. So please feel free to jump in the chat, share your perspectives. If you've got some suggestions or things that have worked well, please do jump in as well. Now, with that, Judith, next slide, please. We'll do one more quick poll. We're going to have a couple polls here today because we like to test you and keep you on your toes. How efficient are you currently operating internally? Again, are you thinking about the way in which you're operating across sort of the people, process, and technology spectrum? Would you consider yourselves to be really super efficient? You know, you've got everything nailed down. You guys are operating like a very tightly oiled machine. Are you say you're sort of efficient or somewhat efficient? In other words, there's probably some room for error. Maybe you've got a plan in place, a strategic plan, and you're thinking about all the operational items that you're going to focus on to improve. Or maybe there's lots of room for improvement, perhaps very frustrating. You feel that there's just not that efficiency that you're looking for as a team, and certainly perhaps even looking to improve that. So with that, Judith, I don't know how many polls we're waiting to, people we're waiting to hear from.
Yeah, it would be great if the last few could press your voting buttons so that we can get as many responses as possible. Also, just to echo what Joanne has said about using the chat, for those of you that have already voted efficient, and about 29% of you currently have voted as efficient, it might be that you want to comment on some of the ideas that Scott and Ash particularly share, and whether you've already implemented those or not in the chat. That would be great to see. So I'll give you 5 more seconds to vote if you haven't already. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll end the poll. And now you can all see the results.
Wow, that's great. Somewhat efficient. All right, well, that's a great indication. We're going to have some great suggestions for you here. I hope the people who indicated efficient were the fastest to respond on the polls and were very efficient themselves. So good to see. Thank you so much, everyone, for voting. We're going to have a couple more polls throughout the program. With that, Judith, next slide, please. All right, now is the time when I will turn it over to Ash to take us through.
Thanks, Joanne, and hi, everyone. Great to have you on this call. So look, efficiency and efficiency is a word that I've always struggled with because much like the word innovation, it can mean anything to anyone depending on how you want to talk about it and sell it. So I remember once going into my boss's office and was told you need to be more efficient and your team needs to be more efficient. And I walked out of that office thinking, oh my God, where do I even start with that? What does it mean? You know, there's no pinpointing, there's no direction. So what I did do at that point was sat down with the team and told them we have to be more efficient. And they had similar reactions to me like that. What? So we kind of decided to map out what our day and our life looks like and where we believe we were inefficient or we were lacking some efficiency. And that gave us a better route to really trying to identify where we should change things up and notch or two and what we could do differently in order to improve, you know, in quotes, efficiency. Again, keep my boss happy at the time. So here you can see, you know, from the clients that we work with, a number of areas where we keep hearing about what we would determine as being inefficient ways of working internally. So often, obviously, the reactive team with no prioritization, you've got a limited amount of resource within your team, but they're having to be reacted to the never-ending demands that the business put on them. He or she who shouts the loudest gets control of the lawyers, and they get to kind of focus on urgent requests that have been sat on for the last sort of 2 months and just chucked across saying this is urgent, you need to get on with it. But there's no real sort of prioritization around risk or value or anything that goes with it. And it's incredibly difficult to be efficient if you can't plan, and you can't plan if you're always being reactive. So there's a big piece around this. And then obviously, if you're being reactive, you just chuck the sort of the finite resource you've got at the work. Often senior lawyers doing more junior work just to get it off the desk, get it done. That isn't cost efficient either. So there's a different way that we can look at efficiency from a cost perspective. Then my other sort of pet peeve word, innovation, which we hear about all the time. And I'm going to look at this with a slightly different lens from talking about how tech can help. And of course, technology and innovation can help in a number of different ways if applied in the right way. But what I've also seen is people getting so excited about the use of technology and how it's going to change the world and how it's going to be the silver bullet to all of their in-house issues, that they get lost. They start this sort of trek into a tunnel of darkness of the legal tech industry, not knowing quite what to pick, what tools to pick, how to implement them. And a lot of time and resource can be taken up with that. So we're going to have a quick look at that later in this presentation as well. Our third parties drain our time. So often clients have big rosters and big panels of third-party law firms, private practice or LPOs or alternative legal providers. the more you have, the more difficult that is to manage. They all have their own ways of working. They all have their own different terminologies. They never probably quite work like you want them to work, because they're doing bits and pieces, not really understanding your business fully, which means you have to then take the time to really kind of, every matter that comes through, talk to them about it, give them the scope, you just walk them through a longer, more drawn out process than necessary. So again, we'll touch on that. Scott will be speaking about that in a minute. And then, the age-old problem is, well, I believe I'm inefficient or somewhat efficient, but how do I actually prove this? And then if I make a change, how do I know if I'm getting more efficient? Is it just a feeling that I've got, or is there other way of capturing this information? And that's around the data and how data can be used to help the journey going forward. You're on mute, Scott.
You'd have thought after 3 years in COVID, I'd have learned how to press the unmute button. Thank you. So let's look at what we mean by efficiency externally. And look, similarly, just Sasha's been saying, it's probably easier to look at some of the pain points that people have, and very much the approach that we take when working with clients is to look at, what are the areas of resistance, what are the things which aren't working, and then actually it becomes a bit clearer what sorts of techniques we use to solve them. So the sorts of things that I'm going to be talking about here will be very familiar to those of you from in-house, I expect, maybe all of them or some of them. So one thing that we know many clients suffer with, and Ash mentioned earlier, is around just having so many third parties that you work with, particularly in the legal space, and just not having a clear line of sight. What are they working on? Where are they within those matters? How much is it costing me? And just to be able to get that sort of overall global view actually across the whole piece, which is so important, being able to manage budgets. Now, another thing that we see is around sometimes the tendency, particularly in private practice, for work to be over-lawyered. And that sort of manifests in two ways. I'm sure you'll be familiar with it. Sometimes it's around, look, it's great to have a partner or somebody who's really senior on something, but I only need them in the right places where they'll add the most value to their experience. I don't need a partner looking at an NDA for me. Thanks very much. I want them to come in just at that point where they're going to add the most value. Similarly, another way in which this manifests is around work products being generated which don't get to the point. So I had one client not so long ago talk to me about a 16-page piece of advice that they'd seen generated by one of their firms on a specific legal point. It was sort of a novel and complicated point, but the problem was 16 pages. It's just like, I don't have time to read that, and it doesn't really tell me what I need to know. Equally speaking, there is quite a lot to be said around teams working consistently. So people find themselves in a situation where their perception, at least, is that there are too many new members coming onto a team, and then the efficiencies which you get through having stable teams are just lost, and it feels like every matter almost the team is having to start from scratch, learning the clients, the ways they want to work, and so on, and that can be immensely frustrating. It's one of the big upsides actually and benefits of having an in-house team, of course, because you're able to work in that way. And then also sometimes you hear around clients feeling that even within one organization, within a law firm, for example, each practice group works differently. So it feels like you're not working with one firm, but you're working actually with a collection of different firms where once again, clients feel they're having to go through the process of educating different departments they might not have worked with around how they work, whereas it is something which should really be known as part of institutional knowledge. So there are quite a lot of these sorts of external pain points too, and recognizing that, interestingly, from the survey we had earlier on, everybody's certainly got a key focus on the internal aspects of working more efficiently. I think it's important to call out some of those external ones as well, because they collectively add up and they create a drag coefficient on in-house teams and how they spend their time.
Great, thank you very much, Scott. All right, now we're going to look at our third poll of the day. So this is a question around your external advisors. As Scott was saying, yes, internal efficiencies are obviously very important, and maybe that's where the burning platform might exist, Scott Nash, is just really let's take care of our own house first and then look to external advisors. But let me ask the question, how good are you at managing the value your external advisors deliver? So this is really about making sure you get the best and maximize the most out of those external provider relationships. Would you say you're outstanding, very good, good? Maybe there's room for improvement, or perhaps there's a lot of room to improve. Last night or earlier today, we had some responses around value. What value? Certainly some challenges there. So love to hear your views on this particular poll and understand really, do you feel like you're getting the most value, and are you good at managing that value?
Okay, thank you, Joanne. So we've had more than half of you vote, but it would be great to get a few more in so we can really get a sense of the room. So if you take the last few seconds available to press your buzzers and vote on where you're currently at, that would be brilliant. And we will look to close the poll in 5 seconds. So the last flurry of activity. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. Let's end the poll and share.
I feel like I was leading the witness by suggesting that there's should be a response in value, what value, but lo and behold, there's certainly some of you out there feel like perhaps not getting the most, but otherwise, I think around the middle, right? We could do better. I think certainly there's probably always room for improvement in everything that we do, but glad to see that there's also some people that are really leveraging that value as much as they can. So thank you so much for voting again.
Okay, so the efficiency vision. So we kind of painted out some areas that are inefficient both internally and externally, and now obviously what can we do about those? How can we improve things? So you can see on the left hand side of this screen you've got the kind of levers we can pull to help with internal efficiencies, and on the right hand side some of the levers around the external efficiencies. And the good news is, as we kind of touched on earlier, there's quite a lot of overlap. Okay, so you've got the use of technology, you've got the team operating model, you've got the data side of things. So that means we can consolidate these and be efficient with our time today to really focus in on those areas that are going to have the biggest gains across the piece. And these would be here, third-party supplier management, which we'll touch on, operating model review, that covers both in-house and your external providers. Use of technology we'll speak about, and then the data and reporting side, all of which should help then drive more efficiency throughout. Okay, so team operating model. You would have likely or possibly seen a slide like this before. It's a tool we use quite often when first speaking with clients who are struggling, and we just sit down with them for an hour or so and talk through all the different sort of aspects of legal service that they or their third parties have to provide. And you can see on the vertical axis you've got, if I just zoom in, you've got the exposure to risk, and on the horizontal you've got strategic importance. Okay, so we plot all these different things out to show you know, where and how important different elements of the law are to each of our clients. Okay, so anything that appears in the bottom left hand corner or quadrant there, you would think it actually is relatively low risk and low strategic value, and therefore shouldn't really take an awful lot of the in-house team's time. And top right would be really where you want to spend most of your time and effort from your in-house to support those strategic priorities going forward. The reality is, when we sit down and we plot this and we say, okay, let's now look at where your time, your in-house team's time, is spending their days and weeks, often we find them spending it in that bottom left-hand quadrant. Okay, that's where you get sucked in, because that's where the reactive nature of the demands from the business come in, and that means that they're, you know, fully their full capacity is taken up with that kind of less valued work. And then unfortunately what that means is you have to outsource the more strategic and the high value work in the top right-hand quadrant. So this is where we use this tool to start opening that conversation up, so people can then start to say, okay, how do we free up the resource? So you've got NDAs in the bottom left-hand corner, right? So we should really be automating NDAs, making that self-serve to the business. Could we use an LPO for everything in that bottom left-hand quadrant, right? Where do we want to use private practice? And this just draws out that conversation. Every client's going to be different about how they want to do this. Some people we've worked with actually have used it to say, we've got a gap in in-house expertise and we need to get an extra hire, and we can sit down with our CFO and draw this out. So this model helps start a lot of conversations that will help you improve the efficiency of where you're going to need third parties, where you should be using the third parties, and where you really prioritize the time and effort of your in-house team, and get that kind of cost efficiency as well of getting the senior resource in your team to be focusing on that high value work.
Thanks, Ash. So we're now going to have a look at technology and also data as two of the other tools in the toolkit for efficiency. I'm going to start off with tech. So I have to say that I love this area. I get to speak about it. I am a bit of a self-confessed geek, having had a programming background before I came to law. And I say against that background that you know, the first thing really to put out there is the technology in itself is not necessarily a driver of efficiency. Okay, so tech for tech's sake isn't really going to move the dial for you. And I say that simply because of this. The analogy that I always like to use is a bit like saying, look, I've got a fantastic new word processor, so now I'm going to write brilliant documents. Okay, I mean, we know that doesn't work that way. But the application itself, of course, can be an incredibly useful tool for improving efficiency and improving the quality of what you do. And so it's the same actually with legal tech as well. It's certainly been an area which actually going back probably for about 10 years now, I'd say, you know, clients have been very, very interested in. If I think back in the day, I suppose when this was just starting to come onto radars, we saw, you know, many RFPs or inquiries from clients around, well, you know, what legal tech can you offer us? And the truth is, I think a lot of time in the early days was spent on talking about different sorts of tech applications. They were often not taken up, and where they were, they didn't really move the dial. And I think the other thing that has changed with the market in this area of maturing is around the understanding that what we've seen emerge is a number of vendors who can offer different tech solutions in quite narrow verticals. And so the approach that we always take when working with clients, we know many clients take as well, who are very sophisticated these days, is actually to be technology and vendor agnostic. The starting point is always to work out what are the problems you've got to solve, and then try to identify, well, is there a technology solution which might solve it? And then you do a search to see whether there are vendors, one or more, who've got a suitable product. So that's the sort of approach that we take. And I think that when you look at some of the pain points we identified in the opening slides around feeling inefficient, whether externally or internally, for sure, there are some good tech tools here these days which can help with this. But as I said, by themselves, they're not going to be a silver bullet. So what I'm going to spend a few minutes looking at now are probably four, I think, of the most commonly sought after tech tools. So we'll talk about document automation, around workflow management systems, around also sort of contracts and document management. And then, of course, it wouldn't be complete to have a section on legal tech without talking about AI. So we'll touch on that as well. But this is a bit of a lightning tour, a taster only. You know, obviously you could spend a long time in this subject, and indeed, it is the subject of a different seminar that we hold. But starting off with document automation. So what are we talking about here? For those of you that haven't come across it before, document automation software lets you customize a well thought out precedent by use of a series of questions that are leveraged off a logic tree. And so we know that there are quite a few organizations these days that are using document automation, say for something like NDAs. A bit of a low-hanging fruit there. The way that would work is that you would fill in a sort of front form the names of the parties and probably the purpose of the conversations, whatever the project is, and then the automated document software produces an NDA ready for signature. That works really quite well. The truth is, however, that it's possible to automate a huge number of different sorts of documents, and you know, NDAs is great, but actually, if you look at what we work with clients on in Dentons, there's probably 30 or 40 different sorts of document types that we automate. It can be very, very sophisticated these days. So, for example, we'd automate all sorts of services agreements, framework agreements, SaaS framework agreements, for example, in the TMT field. And we would have the ability through the logic tree to ask quite a bunch of questions that will let you get a long way in a decent first cut. So we might ask a question along the lines of, will any intellectual property be created as part of this engagement? If the answer is yes, then we can get the automation software tool to put in some IP ownership clauses. We might have another question along the lines of in a different sort of contract. Is there going to be any possible transfer of employees if a new provider is coming in and taking over the role of an existing provider with a dedicated team? And if the answer was yes to that, we could build in what many of you will be familiar with in a European context, some transfer undertakings, 2P type language to cover that off, and so on. But equally speaking, we've worked with clients to automate a whole bunch of real estate documents, whether it's licenses or lease renewals, consents, and so on. And even in fact, in litigation, we automate settlement agreements and other important documents along those lines. So you can do an awful lot with automation these days, a lot more than people historically have been used to. I think sort of the question here, though, which we're looking at, it is not so much kind of, you know, that's quite cool, what can you do with it, but how far will it move the dial in terms of efficiency? And what I think our experience is that it'll do us a bit, but actually it won't be revolutionary. So, you know, generally we'd find that, you know, in a very simple form, say, for example, the NDA example that we gave you, that might give you, say, a 5 to 10% time saving, maybe. Something more complex, you might sort of nudge up to perhaps 15% time saving, but it doesn't really, you know, sort of revolutionize the whole delivery of things. In fact, funnily enough, one of the best benefits that comes out of a document automation exercise we found working with clients is actually the discipline of putting in place some really good, well thought out precedents. Now, having precedents, which is the subject actually of a different talk, and some of you might have heard Ash and myself speak on that a month or so back. Now that can give you some very big upsides, investing the time to get some really good intellectual capital. So that is a hidden benefit of having document automation. If it drives you to put precedents in place, then that's a great thing. There is also another really, I guess, more exciting use of document automation, which I will mention now. And that's simply this: if you use document automation as a vehicle to drive self-service, that can be really powerful, and that can really move the dial. Again, Ash and I actually touched on this about a month back, for those of you who joined us. But what do we mean by self-service? What we're talking about here is the idea of empowering non-lawyers within your businesses to actually do some of the work themselves, by giving them great precedents, which are automated, maybe supported by guidance notes or playbooks, so they can actually deliver some of the work themselves. And so using document automation as part of a self-service drive really can make a big difference. And we've worked with a number of clients that have saved very, very meaningful amounts of time and money doing that. The next thing to talk about is around workflow management systems. So one of the pain points that we were talking about earlier, you might remember, was the situation where it's just really difficult to get a handle on all the work that's going on across the piece, whether that's internally, so understanding, you know, what is the internal team doing across all the different stakeholders and pieces of the business, or whether it's external. So as we were saying, being able to draw together what are all the different external providers doing, what stage of matters are, how much is it costing us, and so on. And this actually where a workflow management system is really, really important. Now, it is a bit of an investment, actually, certainly in terms of time and getting it structured and stood up. There is a cost for workflow management systems as well. Quite often, these are known as legal front doors. That's an increasingly popular term for these. In fact, Dentons, we operate one of those for our clients as well. But it does bring some huge benefits, because what it'll enable you to do is get a single view of everything that's going on, whether it's internally or externally. It'll allow you to deal with work allocation, for example, to understand quickly at a glance how much work's going on, what your overall cost position is, what the cost position might be for individual matters, how long the work's taking, and also it gives you the ability to have a work area for each matter. So contract and document storage and so on. So these systems definitely help with efficiency, and they help with overall understanding of what's going across the business. They're also, I'll just flag now, a very important way, in fact, probably the only way of being able to collect data and leverage your data, which I'm going to touch on in the next slide. Before we get onto that, however, no talk on technology would be complete, as I was saying, without talking about AI. So it's probably impossible to pick up the paper these days without reading about ChatGPT. Not sure if any of you have tried it. I've tried it. We read the wondrous things it can do, whether it's writing poetry or songs or writing university dissertations. People might have seen that there's one exam board now which is accepting essays written using ChatGPT as being admissible for coursework. Apparently it can write resumes for you. The sky's the limit. Certainly it's true that AI is coming on leaps and bounds. But those of you who have played around with ChatGPT or some of the other sort of early phase public platforms you can use will know that it is quite limited still. It does get the answers wrong very often. People might have read about Google's recent foray into releasing their own AI, where they had misanswered in one of their sort of promo clips on Instagram some basic facts about how the universe works and so on. There definitely are problems. Actually, one of the problems that you could see within that example is around QA, and it's around the fact that AIs are very, very good at processing information and organizing it, but they're not necessarily very good at validating the authenticity of information and sources. And so actually, the good news for lawyers on the call is that our experience is that lawyers aren't about to be replaced by machines quite yet. Having said that, there are some really interesting applications out there. The way that the market has developed in the AI field, there's been a number of vendors who are developing really quite narrow AI applications. And so which one you'd use, in fact, would tend to turn on what you're trying to do with it. Are you trying to use something to help take the heat out of the due diligence exercise versus some analysis on, say, an estate of contracts, where you're wanting to understand your exposure in a particular area, versus getting into analysis and e-discovery and so on. So there's different applications for all of those. And also, having said that, one of the issues with AI is that they are less accurate, and there are QA problems compared to humans being involved. It's also interesting to know that's not always the case. In the right sort of use cases, they can be more accurate. We run a lot of trials here for training the AIs that we work with. And in one of the early trials, we were benchmarking in the world of real estate and AI against human teams, analyzing a very specific aspect of assignment rights under documents. And in fact, the AI came in with a higher level of accuracy than humans did, just marginally. So AIs can be very helpful in that way. But I think what we'd say at this stage is that the way I would look at AI is the opportunity to be able to take some of the early legwork out of a large trawl of data. So it means, therefore, that for individual lawyers, they need to spend less time doing, if you like, kind of the less valuable work, and they can spend more time working with something which has already been searched or sorted for them. So that's as far as we have got at the moment, but it is an area which we are, certainly expecting to develop. And then that's a great segue into data and continuous improvement. So one of the things which we know clients are also really interested in these days is around being able to leverage their data to understand much better what's going on across the business. The issue is, how do you get the data? And this actually is where there's a very important overlap with technology. So having said that technology isn't the silver bullet, it's what you can do with technology which could really move the dial. This, I think, is one of the best use cases, because if you use a technology platform, particularly some sort of legal or workflow contract management system to collect data, then you can do incredible things with the data. But unless you have some sort of system like that, then it's very, very hard to collect data. And so what we do with clients when we're standing up a legal front door as part of certainly the work that we do through Dentons Helix, providing a streamlined managed service, is we actually hardwire data capture into the front door and into everything that we do, which means that we can then really engage meaningfully with clients and tell them all sorts of things about their business that they couldn't otherwise. So this sort of big data approach is something that is of great interest and could really have enormous upsides. So what we've got here on the screen at the moment is just a couple of sample screenshots of some of the reporting that is possible to produce if you capture the right data. And again, I'm just going to talk about this very briefly because it's really the subject of a different session, but I just want to illustrate the points here because it is quite interesting what you can do with it. So the slide we've got here in the top left-hand corner, where you can see sort of various curves and graphs and so on, what this is doing is it's capturing how long it takes to deliver particular contracts. And again, using a workflow management system, you would be doing that as a default. And what you can do here is you can measure the efficiency that a team has, or an external provider has, or a managed service provider, if that's what you have, in delivering your work. And you can see there's some quite pleasing graphs here showing that overall the time taken to deliver a contract is trending downwards, which indeed is what you'd expect it to do to a level at which point you probably would expect it to sort of more or less flat line. But I mean, we've had experience working with clients where it's been possible to reduce the length of time to contract by as much as 50% over a period of time by analysing the data and feeding that into continuous improvement. And another way in which that can be done can be, again, if you have a look, I know these are very small, so apologies, and they're just meant to be kind of tasters, as it were, but I'll just explain to you, there's a scattergram in the bottom left-hand corner, which has got a series of dots, which are too small to see what they are. But what this is doing is it's one of the reports that can be run, which is reports by different areas of the business, and showing on the x-axis how many days it's taking to close a contract, so time to contract and days from start to finish, versus on the y-axis how many legal hours it's taking in order to deliver that contract. And you can plot different business units against those two axes, and you get a heat map, which shows you what's the average. You can see clustered around the middle here, which are the outliers, both doing it very quickly and taking a long time. And actually outliers might not be bad, but they might be areas where there's the opportunity to investigate. So you might be able to see here, for example, that marketing is taking twice as long as procurement in order to close contracts. Why is that? So that's something that you could then talk to marketing about, deep dive, and there could be things you might be able to do actually to improve the efficiency of their contracting. So there can be some big upsides there. And then the final thing that I'll just mention here before we move on data is around the slide here in the bottom right hand corner. This actually is showing a different sort of data capture, and this is around contract insights and around the positions that an organization is capturing in its contracting. And so again, you can only do this if you have a technology platform, some sort of legal front door, or some sort of platform that allows you to capture this. But what we would do, for example, through Dentons Helix is that in every single contract that we were managing for a client, we'd agree perhaps a dozen, perhaps as many as 20 data points that we'd be measuring, and we'd capture the data on that and report on it. So, for example, we could report on what sort of liability caps you're achieving over a period of 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. Is your liability position improving, or is it actually getting worse? What sort of coverage are you getting for, I don't know, for cyber breach, for example, or what sorts of indemnities are you achieving? And you can report on all of that, and that's actually very important because it gives you an ability to understand organizationally what is your risk profile, and in particular, actually, where there's outliers, where there's areas where things are deteriorating. So let's imagine, for example, what the report shows is that over a period of 12 months, your ability to get unlimited indemnity liability for cyber breach has halved, which indeed did happen over a period of time post GDPR. It means you can actually measure that, and then it allows you to flag to the business conversations with CTOs saying, look, we're carrying much more organizational risk here around this. This is just really scratching the surface, I think, of what can be achieved through data. And the importance here with all this information is that you take it, you actually want to make the data useful rather than just interesting. And so what you're always trying to do here is spot the nuggets of insight which allow you to then reflect on it and change what you're doing to become more efficient. That's all I'm going to say on data for now. Let's move on to the next slide then, Ash.
Thank you. So third-party supplier management. So we talked about the time drain that can be in place when you've got a number of different legal third parties that you're trying to juggle and get the best out of. And I'm going to talk through a few points of how we can kind of make those relationships more efficient and remove quite as much management time as taken. So you go from being an in-house legal department to supplier manager almost when you've got these third parties working. And I know this is really a very basic place to start, but I think actually it's the quickest win. Communication, and communication is absolutely key, but it's the area that we all often fall short on. Okay. In my past role, I was COO for the UK and Middle East of Denton. So I was more on the buyer side of buying services from providers. And it's very interesting for me now to be on the other side where I'm selling services, because I see quite how bad I was at buying them, and all the things that I did that I thought was the right thing to do to get the best deal for the business and all of that. Actually, what I was doing was damaging relationships, and now being on the other side, I realized actually communication, if I had taken the time to get regular slots in with my key stakeholders and my suppliers, and actually turned up with the right agenda, had this very open, honest conversation of what's working for me and what isn't working for me, and to hear from them what's working for them and isn't working for them, then we've got something we can actually take forward and improve that relationship. So, you know, documenting actions, for instance, if we agree something, let's make sure we do it on both sides. It feels very basic, and it feels like something we probably all think we do, but I guarantee in so many cases we could just do it better to start building that trust through supplier and buyer of legal services. And this kind of then flows on to the next one, which is the scoping of matters. I'm a big believer in upfront effort. Okay, so anytime there's a new matter of a certain size, it's definitely worth taking some time to do some scoping with your legal service providers, to sit down, really understand kind of what it is you're trying to deliver, be very clear with assumptions on both sides that's being made. Often, you know, assumptions really do bite later on in a delivery. And the clearer the instruction can be up front, then the more efficient you're going to be later on, because you do not have to be so involved in the matter going forward, because it's very clear any escalations that are required, how they should happen, any communications that need to be taking place throughout the matter delivery, how do they come back to you, what's the best method, how do you want that to be done. And then the flip side of the same coin there, scoping ski, let's do post-matter reviews as well. So after a matter, again, of a certain size, don't do it for every matter because you drown. You know, sit down and say, this went well, this was great, continue to do this, and this didn't do so well. And again, I've been through so many RFPs now where, you know, it's always determined that we're going to be doing post-matter reviews, and we often do them for about 3 months, and then it kind of falls away, and kind of that the novelty's worn off a bit. And so those of you that do them and actually do have that, you know, big honest feedback session, you know, I'm always told that feedback's a gift, and it really is, because you can't change something if you don't know you're upsetting someone by kind of doing a certain action or sort of talking in a certain way, or, you know, not delivering it as others would want. So I think, you know, the two sides there, scope it on the in and then post-matter feedback on the out, actually becomes this lovely cycle of how to improve service, which then frees up, again, the in-house team to be doing what you want the in-house team to be doing, rather than having to jump in to save the day on matters that are going a bit off kilter, or by spending time doing stuff that you shouldn't be doing because they haven't been properly freed up because the brief wasn't there in the first place. I'm just going to pause quickly there because I know, Joanne, this is an area you're well versed in. I just want to know if you want to chip in.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what you said, Ash, because it's all very good points, but certainly reinforce that. It's interesting because before I launched in-house solutions in 2017, I led the marketing department for Dentons in Canada. And, you know, I've seen hundreds of RFPs. I've seen from our side sort of the process and how it can drain internal resources to conduct these convergence programs, to conduct these preferred panels, right? So you've got to identify, you know, what kind of structure you want. You've got to identify what firms you want to invite. You've got to identify what the actual RFP looks like. By that point now, you've sent it off to the firms, and they, you know, sometimes come back with these giant, you know, responses, 100-page responses, and now you're sitting with, you know, 25 to 50 RFPs that you have to review and determine which one is going to be, you know, the best in terms of your panel going forward. I think so much time and energy can be spent on that process that it's often forgotten that the fact that actually managing the panel can be a huge effort in itself, right? As you've described, it's you've got your preferred, you know, supplier management matrix together. But how is it that you're communicating? How is it that you're scoping? All these things are often overlooked because that front end piece can be so exhausting and internally draining. So I just do want to reemphasize or emphasize the point that you've made around how important that communication is. I think I spoke about this for the first time maybe 8 years ago, the idea of this communication breakdown between, you know, the client and the law firms, and not truly being viewed as a partnership. This is what, you know, this should be, is really a partnership, and you know, we're here together to serve the ultimate client, the organization, and that we should be open and communicating. So I just wanted to jump in to reinforce how I think that point can be overlooked. There was a recent survey by Thomson Reuters. It's a state of the corporate law department. I think it was 2022, and they had interviewed a bunch of law firm providers and asked them to review the past cases that they were involved with, and to understand from both their perspective as a law firm, but also the corporate law department, whether or not there were any improvements that could be made. And I think they looked at over 1,000 cases. And I think 90% of the time, the law firms had identified opportunities for the in-house teams to be more efficient when it comes to scoping or communication. And I'm sure the opposite could be said as well. So it's really about, how do we understand where the gaps are, and working together as a team and partners, and bringing your firms together to have those conversations. Certainly a topic in and of itself. We do have a paper that we've got available, so you can reach out to the CX team afterwards, and we can share more about panel management. But back to you, Ash.
Thanks, Joanne. So yeah, lovely segue there to consolidating, and you know, depending on how many law firms or LPOs or legal service providers you've got working for you at any one time, each and every one of them needs love and time and attention. Okay, so it must make sense to consolidate that, but not to consolidate it in such a way that you've got all of the same type of business. So if you think back to the operating model slide we had earlier, you know, you don't want a city boutique law firm doing all of your work in the bottom left-hand corner of that chart, and you don't want your LPOs doing your most strategic work in the top right. So you probably want a different mix of different firms that you're working with in order to get the best, but do consolidate them down. The more you consolidate, the bigger you are to those providers, and therefore the more help you can probably get around things like technology and like automation, some of the good stuff that Scott was talking to help you really guide through that jungle of legal tech that's out there. KPIs, key performance indicators, or KPOs, key performance objectives. These are useful, right? Because these help keep focus of your third-party providers on what's important to you. So this means that you set the parameters with them. So it's part of that communication, what's important to you and what sort of KPIs and KPOs could we put around these to make sure that we do report back in the right way. We have got everybody focusing on the things that they need to be focusing on. And if something doesn't go quite right, we know it hasn't gone quite right because we're capturing it, and then we can come to you and have that conversation. It all feeds this kind of relationship building side of things. I would say that too many KPIs can cause a problem. You can drown in too many KPIs. Probably something I used to do in the old role. Don't go there. Have a few solid, good KPIs, and then after a year maybe look to review them and change them. But it can go both ways as well. KPIs for the third parties, they may also want to put some KPIs on the in-house to make sure the instructions are clear and what have you. All of this leads to more efficiency in those relationships. And the final one I'll talk about here is what we've referred to as rocket resourcing. And this is predominantly around the non-legal resources available at your third parties. So LPMs being the great example, legal project managers. There's a mix out there at the moment. It was obviously a new role. Everyone got very excited. So everyone suddenly changed their job titles to become legal project managers. The good ones out there are fantastic. Okay, so if you get them and you can ask for them on your matters, they will help with the planning up front. They will draw out all the right communications and planning. They will draw out efficient pricing. They will make sure you're communicated to in the right way throughout the delivery. Anything going off or the resourcing, what have you, they are there to dedicate themselves to making sure that matter runs the way it should be. So if you find a good one and you see that their fees have been put in to a matter scope, my recommendation would be actually you'll be saving an awful lot of time, hassle, effort, and probably get it delivered cheaper off the back of them being involved rather than not. Right, so if we move on to the next slide. Very basic, nice ladybird there. You are the client, right? And this is kind of the point here. So, feel that and feel empowered to really have these discussions and really drive the narrative with your legal providers, because if it isn't that open, transparent relationship and we don't spend enough time actually talking to one another, things can sort of, fester a little bit and then kind of poison that relationship. So the clearer and easier it is, the more conversations that we have, the better it is in the end.
All right, thank you very much, Ash and Scott, for those comments. So let's just do one final poll for today, wondering whether or not you and your team give feedback. As Ash said, it is certainly a gift, sometimes difficult to give and receive, but very important to do nonetheless. Does your team give feedback to each other and or to your external advisors about where efficiency could be improved? So perhaps always, sometimes, rarely, or never. Love to hear where you are on your feedback efforts.
Thanks, Joanne. Just encourage people to press their buttons. So we'll give you just a few more seconds to vote. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. And we will end the poll and share the results.
Oh, that's fantastic to see. We've got some folks out there who are actively giving feedback. It's funny. Sometimes people don't give feedback and they speak with their feet or speak with the lack of connectivity after that. So sometimes that's the feedback in itself, is we're not going to work together anymore. But it's good to see that feedback is out there, and do strongly encourage it, whether or not it's as Ash said, post matter or on a quarterly basis. That communication is so important. I do ask anyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to come off mute and jump in the chat, or please do jump real live time IRL, as they say, or please jump in the chat with your questions. I think that would be fantastic, but we certainly do appreciate everyone's time here today and look forward to continuing the conversation. All right, any questions? I don't see. Judith, do we have any questions in the chat?
So in the chat, too much time on managing external advisors. I'm sure that's not most people's concern here, but you know, hopefully some of the tips that the team have shared might help improve some of that, especially if you adopt that open communication that Joanne was just talking to, as was Ash. So if anyone wants to message the team, feel free to do that. Interrupt me. It's always a bit hard to do because I speak a lot and fast. So if you want to interrupt me, just take yourselves off mute and ask your question. Otherwise, a big thank you to our panel today and our speakers for sharing their insight. They do create a wealth of materials around this subject matter. And if you want to access them, please just email us at cxprogram@dentons.com. If you email us, we can send you the recording of today's session. That will be available in about a week, as will the slides be available to you as well if you email us. And as I mentioned, they're white papers and other thought leadership guides that you might find useful. Otherwise, coming up next week, we've got a very practical session around managing data and cyber breaches and how to avoid them in the first place and then respond if they do occur. And then on the 18th of April, we'll have a session around ESG and managing your brand and not ending up with greenwashing claims. And finally, we'll close out this season on the 25th of April with our friend Joanne, coming back again, but this time talking about how you can manage your personal brand and demonstrate perhaps your value to the wider organization within which you operate, amongst other things. So really hope you will join us for some of these other sessions. But for now, otherwise, unless there's a question in the chat that people want to answer, we will end today's session and look forward to seeing you next time around. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.